Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio.
Monday, but I will see you tomorrow. But before we get to tomorrow, just want to flag that the Secretary General spoke this morning, today's high-level Security Council meeting on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, noting at the outset the cost of the nearly 6 weeks of the war in Sudan. In that time, he said hundreds of civilians have been killed, including members of the UN family, while 250,000 people have fled the country. The Secretary General added that in his recent report on the protection of civilians found that a total of 100 million refugees have been forced from their homes due to conflict, violence, human rights violations, and persecution. He noted that armed conflict is a key factor driving food insecurity around the world. Last year, more than 117 million people faced acute hunger, primarily because of the war and insecurity. This is an outrage, he said, noting that his newly appointed Famine Prevention Response Coordinator is leading a system-wide response to rising food insecurity. Meanwhile, the Secretary General added that the Black Sea Initiative and the Memorandum of Understanding to promote Russian food and fertilizer to global markets has helped stabilize those markets, bringing down prices and easing the food crisis. In parallel with today's council meeting, a series of informal side events known as Protection of Civilians Week 2023 are taking place in New York this week, coordinated by the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and member states such as Belgium, Switzerland, as well as the NGO Civic and the International Rescue Committee. It brings together member states, UN agencies, Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, civil society organizations to discuss the protection of civilians, including by amplifying the voices of people most impacted by armed conflict. And after the Security Council, the Secretary General walked over to the ECOSOC chamber, where he addressed the opening of the high-level dialogue between the Secretary General and member states of the ECOSOC operational activities for development segment. The Secretary General warned that halfway through the timeline of the 2030 agenda, we are leaving more than half of the world behind. Poverty and hunger are again growing, the climate crisis is escalating, and conflict and persecution have forced 100 million people from their homes. But it is not too late to turn the tide, he said. We are determined to do just that. The Secretary General noted that when we start the reform process, no one foresaw that our country teams would be operating in such challenging conditions, pointing out that despite that, 4 years on, the reforms have succeeded. And in his report on the implementation of the quadrennial comprehensive policy review demonstrates just that. Mr. Guterres underscored that the resident coordinator system is the anchor for all our efforts to support countries in achieving the 2030 agenda. Yet in 2022, the resident coordinator system suffered from a funding gap of $85 million, noting that countries are spending more than $2 trillion a year on military budgets, and that it is simply not credible to pledge support for peace if they are not prepared to invest in a tiny fraction of this amount in sustainable development, the greatest conflict prevention tool we have. Turning to Sudan, our humanitarian colleagues say that following the recent ceasefire agreement, humanitarian organizations are ready to move about 168 trucks to reach more than 4 million people across the country. However, currently conditions are not allowing for full-scale humanitarian operations. However, despite these challenges, we and our partners are expanding humanitarian operations to some locations in Sudan. WFP has now reached 500,000 men, women, and children in several states with food and nutrition assistance since distribution resumed on May 3rd. For its part, UNICEF is supporting Sudan's Ministry of Health in maintaining immunization services across the country. As of May 16th, vaccine supplies for nearly 244,000 children were sent from Khartoum to 7 states. UNICEF has also delivered nearly 1,500 cartons of ready-to-use therapeutic food to an orphanage in Khartoum, where more than 300 children are facing acute food shortages due to the ongoing fighting. From the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I can tell you that we and our partners are continuing to help government respond to the deadly floods and landslides in the east of the DRC. In Kalehe territory in the eastern province of South Kivu, which was hit particularly hard. At least 17,000 people have received assistance since May 10th. This includes food, health care, shelter, and psychosocial support. We've also provided more than 50,000 liters of clean water to impacted communities on a daily basis. The humanitarian coordinator for the UN in the DRC, Bruno Lemarquis, allocated $3 million from the humanitarian fund to strengthen the ongoing operations. According to the latest official figures, at least 443 people have died, hundreds have injured, and many more still missing. More than 3,000 homes were damaged, as well as schools serving 9,000 children. Our colleagues said there's still an urgent need for tools to excavate and bury bodies of the victims. Other top priorities are shelter and relocation of survivors, food assistance, fixing roads and bridges so we can get to people most impacted. And in Myanmar today, the humanitarian community launched a flash appeal asking for $333 million to help communities devastated by Cyclone Maka over a week ago. The acting resident humanitarian coordinator for Myanmar, Ramathan Balakrishnan, said that we are still in a race against time to provide people with shelter and prevent the spread of waterborne diseases. Mr. Balakrishnan said that if we fail to mobilize enough resources, those impacted by the storm will face a long and miserable monsoon season. The flash appeal aims to support some 1.6 million people in high-impact zones across Rakhine, Ching, Magwe, Sangang, and Kachin states. And today is the International Day to End Obstetric Fistula. As you know, obstetric fistula is a condition that can lead to infections, kidney disease, painful sores, infertility, and even death. It is treatable, and more importantly, it is preventable. The UN Population Fund leads the global campaign to end fistula to transform the lives of vulnerable women and girls around the world. Basta. It's your cue to ask questions, should you have any. Yes, sir. Sorry, yeah, I should have told you how this whole system works, right? I speak, you ask questions, but that's all right. Take your time.
Today, the UN Secretary, as I said, UN Secretary General, in his address to the Security Council on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, didn't mention Ukraine casualties caused by the Russian war. He only recalled the Black Sea Initiative. Is this an accident, or is there some reason for such forgetfulness?
I think the Secretary General was speaking about protection of civilians in all conflict. He mentioned the 100 million refugees have been displaced by war. I think we, the Secretary General, this UN system as a whole, has been very vocal about the need to protect civilians, protect civilian infrastructure, and so on in the conflict in Ukraine. Celia.
Steph, could the war in Sudan have an impact on the peace in South Sudan?
Well, the ongoing conflict in Sudan, if not halted, can very likely have a regional impact. The region itself is rather fragile. It could have an impact on what is going on in South Sudan. It could have an impact in Chad. I mean, you're seeing a country like Chad which is already dealing with its own challenges, welcoming more refugees, welcoming Chadians who are returnees. On top of that, we know there are refugees from Cameroon, Central African Republic, and other places. We need to have the leadership in Sudan, the two generals who are fighting each other, put the interest of the Sudanese people first and foremost. We've been outlining the humanitarian tragedy that is unfolding, but this will risk not only impacting Sudan, which it already is, but the region as a whole. Abdelhamid.
Thank you, Stefan. Yesterday, I asked you about the meeting of the Israeli cabinet in a tunnel under the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Your comment was about Ben Ghafir's storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but the meeting of the cabinet, which is a major development, U.S. State Department issued a strong statement about that. They assigned $18 million to expand on excavating more tunnels under Al-Aqsa. And I didn't see any comment from the UN, neither from the SG nor from Tor Winsland, on this specific.
I think we are concerned, and we do not want to see anything that changes the status quo of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and of all of the religious sites in Jerusalem.
Yeah. The second question, yesterday Israel killed 3 Palestinians in Balata refugee camp. Killing Palestinians becoming a daily action by Israel. Almost no day passes without killing a Palestinian. It's killing Palestinians becoming no news. It's becoming regular. Like exactly storming the Al-Aqsa Mosque today, about hundreds of settlers also stormed Al-Aqsa, and yesterday, and tomorrow. It's becoming no news. Would the UN accept this kind of breach of international law and humanitarian law to see that repeated again and again?
Abdelhamid, what is news and not news is the purview of journalists, right?
Yeah.
It's not the purview of the UN. In fact, the Secretary General of the UN has spoken repeatedly about the ongoing violence in the occupied West Bank. We put reports out and reports out. So whether or not that gets covered is a question you need to ask journalists. We've repeatedly expressed our concern about and spoken out very clearly against the continuation, the expansion of settlements, which are against international law. We've continually spoken out of our concern on the continued violence and the impact on Palestinian civilians. We continue to urge all to do whatever they can to reduce tensions and to see a stop to this violence. Yvonne.
Thanks, Steph. 2 questions. First, on Sudan. The UN is monitoring this week-long ceasefire along with other parties. Is that correct? And exactly how are they carrying out the monitoring?
I think the Mr. Pertz spoke about it pretty clearly, that we are ready to support, provide strategic and technical inputs to security arrangements. But we are not, as far as I know, we are not part of an official monitoring mechanism.
Second question. Sorry.
No, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Second question is on the 2 Taiwanese journalists who were accredited to attend the World Health Authority meeting in Geneva this week. They had their credentials revoked abruptly yesterday, and the UN officer reportedly told them that it was because of pressure from China. Does the UN Secretary General approve of these credentials?
I don't have
being
any
taken
information
away?
on that, but let me check on that and we'll get back to you.
Okay, because the WHO said that the accreditation was governed by the UN, not.
Okay, no, I will check on that and get back to you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And then, sorry, just to follow up on that, given that this event is going on this week in Geneva, the World Health Authority meeting, does the Secretary General have any comment on the exclusion of Taiwan once again from this meeting, given that they were the first to raise the alarm about the coronavirus?
The membership of the World Health Assembly is a question to be decided by the members of the World Health Assembly. Yep. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Hi, Stefan. Vladimir Kosterev, TASS News Agency. Have you looked up at the situation at Belgrade yesterday? Have you any comments about what happened?
Yes, Vladimir, thank you. We're obviously following with concern the reports of incident in the Belgorod region of the Russian Federation. We've seen the statements and are aware of statements made by officials both in Ukraine and the Russian Federation. As far as the UN is concerned, we're not in a position to confirm the reports or any information concerning the groups allegedly involved in what we are seeing in the media. We do, however, call on all parties to ensure that the fighting does not escalate or spread and to refrain from actions or rhetoric that could further raise tensions. Sylviane, excuse-moi.
Thank you, Stefan. The Israeli Army Chief of Staff, General Halevi, warned today that a new war against Israel from Lebanon will be 70 times more difficult for Lebanon and even more so far Hezbollah, because Hezbollah was staging the biggest maneuver in years in southern Lebanon, commemorating the 2011. Any comment from any warning? This warning is, it seems very dangerous for Lebanon.
Well,
how much the UN
they're
is...
obviously, we're very much aware of tensions going on in southern Lebanon. We have a peacekeeping mission there with an established mechanism that brings together the Israeli Defense Forces, the Lebanese armed forces with the UN. It is very important that all the parties use this mechanism to address any outstanding issues and to do whatever they can to avoid any conflict. Let me go to the screen and I'll come back. Oh, sorry, Murad, you had a question. Let's finish the first round and then we'll go
Thank you,
to
Stephen.
the second.
On Sudan, for the all human rights violations that committed in this fight, what the UN is going to do, and is there a message from the SCG on this regard?
In this type of conflict, the two first victims are usually hunger and human rights. We are aware of very disturbing reports of human rights violations, including sexual violence, and all sorts of other violations. There will need to be accountability. All of the parties involved in this conflict have a responsibility to uphold international human rights law, to uphold humanitarian law, and everyone will need to be held to account. Betul, and then we'll go to Stefano on the screen.
Thank you, Steph. The SG has now a special coordinator for Afghanistan, the former Turkish ambassador, to find a way on how to deal with the Taliban regime. Are we going to hear from him from time to time, or is it going to be you or on the work of what he's doing?
My understanding is that he was named following the passage of the resolution by the Security Council. He will report back to the Security Council, and when we get close to that time, we'll see if we can get him here to see you. Mr. Vacara.
Thank you very much, Stefan. The Secretary General during the G7, he said that time had come to fix Bretton Woods system and reform the UN Security Council. He said that this is essentially a question of redistributing power in the line with the realities of today's world. Question is, does he think that the Security Council should have new permanent members or just adding new elected members?
Listen, the exact formula will need to be found by the member states themselves. I think the Secretary General has spoken out very clearly in ways that are more eloquent than myself on this issue. He has also notably pointed out the fact that Africa is arguably the only continent that does not have a permanent representation on the Security Council, which hits at the legitimacy of a lot of the work that the Security Council does, given that so much of it is actually focused in Africa. I would refer back to what he said very clearly in Kingstown in Jamaica about 10 days ago, and also what he said in his press remarks in Japan, in Hiroshima, on that issue.
Yes, but just one thing. I understand, and I read his comments on Africa, but because the reform did not happen the last over 25 years, because there is this block, between who once had new permanent members and who instead wants another enlargement. If let's say a country that wants to vote a reform, ask the Secretary General and advise, like, okay, what do you think is the better reform, the best reform? What he would say? He must have an idea about it.
Let's see what the question is and who asks it, and we'll see what the advice is. Abdel Hamid.
Thank you. 3 journalists of Al Jazeera had been detained in Egypt, some of them for 4 years. On 28 April, the court decided to release Hisham Abdelaziz, but after he was released, they canceled it and they put him back in detention. And this is, I think, his 4th year also. So is there any contact between the UN and the Egyptian authority to protest
This issue has been brought up in the past. We continue to be very concerned about the fate of journalists who were imprisoned just for doing their work, whether it's in Egypt or any other country where we're seeing it. And we have seen a trend throughout the world, a very worrying trend recently, of journalists being harassed, imprisoned, or even worse. It's hard to imagine how we can operate in this very complex world without journalists being able to do their work freely. Sylviane, and then Beytoum.
On the Syrian president, the President Bashar Assad has been welcomed warmly at the Arab League. Is there any contact now between the SG and the Syrian president, direct contact?
No direct contact that no direct contact that I'm aware of. Beytoum.
Thanks, Steph. Just to follow up on Abdel Hamid's question, why doesn't the SG have a special envoy for the protection of journalists or a special representative then?
It's an issue that he has been dealing with sometimes himself directly. Our human rights High Commissioner has also been dealing with it. Our UNESCO colleagues have been dealing with it, and we've used other channels. Okay, speaking of other channels, time for the GA channel.
All right, thanks so much for being here. And we're good to go? Excellent. So we just had a really impactful and really powerful discussion with seniors about the cost of living here in Nanaimo, Ladysmith. I'm joined with, of course, the local member of parliament, Lisa Marie Barron, and we heard a lot of stories and a lot of challenges. One of the biggest things is people are really struggling with the cost of rent, and it is taking up so much of seniors' income, particularly seniors living on a fixed income. So we need to do something urgently to make sure we lower the cost of living, make sure people can find a home that's in their budget, and they can afford groceries and the other necessities of life. I also know that today people are going to want to have lots of questions around the Special Rapporteur's report. On that, I want to make it really clear. I respect the work of Mr. Johnson, but I disagree strongly with his finding that a public inquiry is not necessary. I disagree. given how serious the allegations that we've heard, given that it attacks directly people's confidence in our electoral system, we have been calling for a public inquiry, and we remain resolute that a public inquiry is necessary to restore the confidence in our electoral system, to make sure we're showing Canadians that this is something we take seriously, and for people to have an opportunity to see and hear clearly about what's happening and what's being done to tackle foreign interference. This is something that's so serious that it requires a public inquiry. We are going to continue to push for one, and we're going to use every tool at our disposal in the House of Commons to continue to advance a public inquiry. The rigor of a public inquiry, the transparency, and the ability to have questions asked in public and people hear the responses is so important that it is required to deal with the serious allegations of foreign interference. We've seen, though, with the Rouleau Commission, the inquiry, the public inquiry into the Emergencies Act, that we can actually do this in a way that respects national security, because I understand and hear very clearly the importance of us not in any way compromising national security. So I wanted that to be clear. I understand that's a serious concern. We can do that. And the Rouleau Commission showed us that there's a way to ensure national security is not in any way undermined, and we can still have a public inquiry. I do want to point out that there are some findings that the special rapporteur made that are deeply concerning. Those findings were, one, that there was a serious communications breakdown in our intelligence services from what they found and then conveying that to ministers at the highest level. That communication breakdown is something that is completely is wrong. It should not happen and needs to be fixed. There is no justification for that. A breakdown in communication, that needs to be something immediately dealt with. The second piece of really concerning information that was raised by Mr. Johnson is that while there were red flags raised directly to the Prime Minister and to the government, no actionable steps were recommended. The government then just was willfully blind to that and didn't have any follow-up. That is a deeply concerning finding from Mr. Johnson, that despite being flagged of concerning information, the Prime Minister and other ministers did nothing with that. I accept that they were not told to do anything, but that doesn't mean that the responsibility ended. They could have said why. They could have asked for follow-ups. They could have asked for more information. They could have said, why is there no recommended action? And what could we do in addition? The fact that they were so willfully blind to hearing a serious red flag and then not taking any steps, to me, is deeply concerning as well. So there's things that were raised that were concerning. We're going to continue to push for a public inquiry. And I'll just say that in French and then I'll look forward to your questions. Donc, on a eu une discussion, une conversation aujourd'hui avec les personnes âgées, nos aînés ici dans la circonscription de Nanaimo Ladysmith, avec la députée ici, Lisa Marie Byrne. On a eu des discussions, des conversations par rapport au coût de la vie et comment le coût de la vie augmente, et c'est difficile pour les familles, c'est difficile pour nos aînés de rejoindre les deux bouts. Je sais que vous avez des questions sur le rapport de le rapporteur spécial. Je vais dire que je respecte le travail de M. Johnson, mais je ne suis pas d'accord avec sa décision de ne pas déclencher une enquête publique. Je crois profondément qu'on a besoin de l'enquête publique pour restaurer la confiance dans notre système électoral, pour augmenter la confiance de notre démocratie. Pour renforcer cette confiance, c'est essentiel qu'on ait un processus transparent et indépendant. Je vais encore utiliser tous les outils à notre disposition pour avancer l'enquête publique. Je pense que c'est important. Je vais dire deux choses. Ce que M. Johnson a trouvé soulève des inquiétudes. Deux choses. Premièrement, le fait qu'il y a un manque de communication entre nos services de sécurité et les ministres. Cette manque de communication, c'est un problème. On doit régler ça. Deuxièmement, le fait que M. Johnson a soulevé que le Premier ministre et les autres ministres ont eu des informations concernant, des informations inquiétantes, et ils n'ont pas agi. Même, j'accepte le fait que les services d'intelligence n'ont pas donné des actions spécifiques, mais le fait que le gouvernement a eu cette information et n'a pas fait un suivi, il n'a pas fait des autres choses, ça soulève une manque de responsabilité des premiers ministres et des ministres d'agir quand c'est nécessaire de faire plus, au lieu de dire, ils ont dit qu'il n'y a rien à faire, on a accepté ça. À mon avis, ce n'est pas ce qu'un premier ministre ou un ministre doit faire. Ils doivent prendre au sérieux les allégations et faire un suivi. Merci, je suis prêt pour vos questions. I'm ready for any questions you might have.
Bonjour.
Yep.
Oui, bonjour. Donc, utilisez la fonction de la main levée pour poser vos questions. You can use the hand function to ask your questions. We will go online first because we want to go rapidly. So I will give the mic to Stefanoff of CBC News first.
Hello, and thank you for taking my questions. If you could answer in French and English, I would really appreciate it. First,
Sure.
thing, will you get top secret security clearance to view the confidential annex that Mr. Johnson wrote up?
Yes, I will be receiving the top secret clearance to get the same information that Mr. Johnson received. I think that is what a responsible leader of an opposition party would do, and I will be doing that. Oui, je vais recevoir la clearance spéciale pour recevoir l'information confidentielle que M. Johnson a eue. Et je pense que c'est une responsabilité d'un chef de parti d'opposition de recevoir cette information pour savoir ce qui s'est passé.
And you made it very clear you wanted a public inquiry. Do you have any indication from the Prime Minister that he intends to call a public inquiry regardless of Mr. Johnson's recommendation? And if he does not, can you continue to support the government?
So far, the Prime Minister has not in any way indicated that he'll launch a public inquiry. He can still, despite the finding for Mr. Johnston. And so what I'll be doing is I'll be sitting down with the Prime Minister, making it very clear that I disagree with the finding of Mr. Johnston, that a public inquiry is necessary. I will make that very clear. And I'll make it clear to the Prime Minister that we're going to use all the tools that we have at our disposal to continue to push for one at the federal level.
En français, Jagmeet.
Oh oui. Donc, c'est qu'à ce moment, le Premier ministre n'a pas montré une ouverture d'avoir une enquête publique ou de lancer une enquête publique. Mais malgré ça, je vais avoir une rencontre avec le Premier ministre et je vais dire que je ne suis pas d'accord avec la décision de M. Johnson. Je vais dire que je pense qu'on a besoin d'une enquête publique et je vais aviser le Premier ministre qu'on va utiliser tous les outils à notre disposition au niveau fédéral pour forcer ou pour avancer une enquête publique.
Mickey from Canadian Press, you have one question and one follow-up.
I think you might still be on mute.
Sorry, okay. I guess is triggering an election one of the tools that you're willing to use in order to get a public inquiry?
That's not a decision that we're making today, but I will be sitting down with the Prime Minister and letting him know that I don't agree with the decision, that we will be using every tool at our disposal at the federal level to push for a public inquiry.
But why not trigger an election and have, parties run on that mandate, especially in a time when this report says that politicization is kind of interfering with democracy right now? Why not then just put that as a mandate to the public?
Well, for a number of reasons, we're not making that decision today. The fact that there is a serious concern about foreign interference in our elections, and the special rapporteur hasn't completed the work or any recommendations that should be put in place to protect or safeguard our democracy and our election. The fact that we want a public inquiry to protect elections, not an election that is under the cloud of suspicion of foreign interference. That would undermine the work that we're trying to do. Right now, we're not in a position, we're not making that decision today, but we are going to continue to fight to make sure that people can have confidence entirely in our electoral system, that the questions that people have are answered, and that we want to encourage people to participate in democracy. The voting is important, that you can trust that your vote will matter. And we want to make sure that people have that confidence and go out and vote. That's our goal, and that's why we're going to focus on that goal.
The next question is for Raisa Patel.
Hi there. So on the fate of your deal with the Liberals, you keep saying pulling your support on this issue is not off the table, but then you're also saying you won't make that decision today. When will you make that decision? You know, what else needs to not happen for you to make that call? Because all these weeks later, you still haven't got what you're looking for.
And let's be clear. So it's not a decision we're making today. What we are focused on today is making sure we push for what we think is necessary, which is a transparent and independent look into what happened here. The foreign interference allegations are serious. They cut directly to our democracy. And at a time when we see a lot of people and conspiracy theories raised by a lot of people around doubts around electoral results in the States, we don't want that to happen in Canada. That is something I'm deeply concerned about. We've seen declining voter participation in elections. That's something I'm really concerned about. I want people to vote. I want people to feel confident they can vote and their vote matters. And to restore that confidence, I want to make sure we are doing everything possible to safeguard our democracy. So I'm focused right now, our attention right now is how can we push forward better transparency, better accountability around our elections. And so I'm going to sit with the Prime Minister and say, I disagree with the finding. I think Mr. Johnson was wrong here. I respect his work, but I think he's wrong not to declare a public inquiry. And the Prime Minister can do that. And I will also let the Prime Minister know we've got tools. And we're going to use all those tools at our disposal to continue to push for a public inquiry. I respect and understand there's serious and sensitive information that could undermine our national security. I don't want that information disclosed in any way. I don't want to undermine our national security. But we can have a public forum that respects national security and still gives confidence to Canadians. And the example I'll point to is the recent inquiry into the Emergencies Act. That public inquiry created a forum where there was multiple lawyers that asked questions. There was an independent judge that reviewed the information. That allowed for a process that gave Canadians confidence. We could see what happened. We heard the Prime Minister get questioned. We heard other ministers get questioned. We heard other security officials get questioned. It gave Canadians confidence in the decisions around the Emergencies Act. Similarly, we need something like that to happen when it comes to foreign interference. And I believe it can be done, and I'll continue to push for that.
For our follow-up.
You say that you're sitting down with the Prime Minister, you're going to make your position really clear. I feel like you've done that with him already. You say that you're going to use all the tools at your disposal. Are one of those tools, you know, possibly triggering an election and pulling your support from the deal?
Again, that's not a decision we're making today. But what we are making very clear is we're going to use other tools to continue to push for a public inquiry. We've done something in the past where we pushed for a vote in the House of Commons. New Democrats made that happen. We're going to look at other tools to continue to push for a public inquiry. We think that is so essential and so important right now that we're going to continue to use the tools that we have to push for that.
If there's no further question online, we will go to questions in the room. Okay.
We're going to start with Greg from the 9 Month News Bulletin. Okay. Thanks, Vicky. I had a question more related to the discussion
sure, yeah.
today. You mentioned that you've been speaking to seniors, and they were talking about affordability, specifically housing affordability. And I was wondering, as you have these sort of conversations across the country, are the types of problems that you're hearing in BC any different, like the intensity, the severity of what people are dealing with the housing crisis? Is it different here?
Well, what we're hearing is a lot of similar stories that across the country, rent, being able to afford rent, being able to afford to buy a home, these are some of the biggest concerns that Canadians have. And it's quite similar across the country. I would say one big difference is in BC, there are steps being taken provincially that we don't see in a lot of other provinces. But what we're hearing again and again is that it's not enough, that we've got initiatives being done at the provincial level without a partnership at the federal level. And the federal government has not stepped up with the urgency necessary to deal with the problems that we're up against. And one of the major problems is when you look at what's going on in people's income level, you think about seniors on a fixed income and how much it costs to rent a place, they're just so out of balance that people are struggling. We heard stories of people that are spending 60, 70%, in some cases, almost 100% of their income goes towards rent. And they're left in tears saying, well, what can we do to survive if all of our income is going entirely to rent? One example was someone on OAS gets $1,400 a month. The average rent right now in this region is well above $1,400 for a one-bedroom apartment. So what is a senior to do if their rent is far more than they're earning in terms of their fixed income? That is a problem. And that's something we've got to deal with in an urgent way.
A follow-up to that as well. With the House of Commons studying the financialization of the housing market, does that give you any confidence, that any sort of indication that the federal government wants to make moves to address some of the problems related to that?
So this is something that we've been pushing for as New Democrats. We realize that one of the major problems is the housing market has been set up in such a way where it is very profitable for some people, but it means a lot of people don't have a home that they can afford. And that is a problem. The way the housing market has been designed has been making massive amounts of profits for those who've got money, but for everyone else, they're falling behind. And that is something we've got to deal with. So when we look at the solutions, what we're proposing is, of course, we need to build more housing. And there's going to be a significant portion of that that's going to be private building, private developing. But that is not going to solve the problem on its own. Given how there is such a disconnect between what people are earning and what the market rates are, people are not going to be able to find something they can afford if the only solution is to build more private development. So we need to look at how the market has been financialized, or look at how housing has been made to be an investment for rich investors and not a place for people to call home. And so we have to look at ways where we can change that to build more homes that are actually within people's budgets. We look at ways to build homes that are not subject to the market influences, so that are actually within people's means to be able to rent or to buy. And we have to look at alternatives to just a pure market-based solution when we know that that is not going to solve the problem. If market rent is far more than people are actually earning, how is building more of that going to make people find a place they can afford?
Oh, sure. Sorry, I snuck in a little bit late here, Mr. Singh. I'm just curious regarding the news of Mr. Johnson recommending public hearing as opposed to a full-blown inquiry. Do you have an issue with Mr. Johnson, given his relationship with the Prime Minister, to oversee that hearing process, which it seems like we're going down the road in the months ahead? Just want to comment on that.
Yeah, I've said before that I respect the work of Mr. Johnson. I believe he'll do good work, but that I disagree with his decision not to call a public inquiry. And people have raised concerns around the optics. Those are concerns that exist. And I've said in response to any concerns around optics, the optic of Mr. Johnson, the solution is a public inquiry, because it is a process that would have an independent judge, like we saw in the Emergencies Act Commission. That's an independent judge that has no relation or connection in any way to the subject matter of what we're trying to investigate. So having an independent judge, having multiple people ask questions. Right now, we've got Mr. Johnson, who, of course, I respect, but that's one person asking questions of the minister or asking questions of CSIS. We would like to see a process like the Emergencies Act process, where multiple lawyers could ask questions directly to witnesses. Witnesses are compelled to come forward, not just asked, and they may or may not. The powers of a public inquiry would alleviate any questions around the optics that question whether or not the work that's necessary is going to be done. And that's why we've said that Mr. Johnson's work should continue. I think he will do important work, and has already shown he's uncovered two really important findings that point to the government that's willfully blind and ignored serious red flags because they were told there's no action to be taken and didn't do a follow-up. I think that's deeply concerning. The other finding, that there was a breakdown in communication between CSIS and the government. Another finding that was deeply concerning. So he's made some important findings that does not in any way take away from the importance of having a public inquiry, the independence, the rigor of that process to give people that confidence that they need, that everything is being done to safeguard our democracy. So that's why I'll maintain our position that we need a public inquiry. While I respect the work, for various reasons, a public inquiry will address the concerns that have been raised by Canadians.
Well, but a public inquiry, but within the context of protecting some sensitive information, that that seems like, how do you square that circle? That seems like a difficult road to go down. Expand a bit on that.
So it's a very important point. And just to elaborate, the national security question is this: if every single piece of information that's available is put to the public, what that will mean is our security services, the tools that we use, the procedures that are taken, will be known to the people that we are trying to surveil against. So it will undermine our ability to keep Canada safe. I understand that. That is absolutely a very legitimate and very fair concern to be raised, that if everything is put in the public sphere, that the way that we keep our country safe would be undermined, because people are folks that want to undermine Canada's democracy, or people that want to find holes in it, will be able to know the way we actually conduct our security, and that will be a serious detriment to our ability to keep ourselves safe. I understand that. But we've seen with the Emergencies Act Commission that sensitive information, confidential information, was kept confidential, and that a judge made that decision. An independent judge assessed the information and said, well, this information should be kept secret or confidential because of national security. I want an independent judge making that decision. But then there's a lot of information that could be made public, that was made public in the commission with Justice Rouleau. That is an example of how we can actually engage in a process that is transparent, that is public, that still protects national security. That is a template. We've already seen it work. I would suggest we could do the same thing again with that same level of scrutiny to assess what information is in any way challenging or problematic to our national security, and then don't disclose that. And the rest of information that can be disclosed should be disclosed and done in a public way. That would restore confidence and answer any question that Canadians have. I would use that as a template, and we can move forward with that process.
Those are my questions. Awesome. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Appreciate that. That was great. Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.